Rak Yachad, only together. This was President Reuven Rivlin's message to the citizens of Israel on the eve of Rosh Hashanah last week. Israelis are observing Yom Kippur this year, as they did Rosh Hashanah and they will Sukkot, in national lockdown. A country that back in May was acknowledged as a leader for conquering the virus with technology and strong leadership, suddenly found itself as a leader in another sense, with the largest rate of infections in the world. And people were none too happy. This 3-week period is usually a joyous time in Israel. Schools close, businesses close. Many Israelis travel to visit friends or experience the land, but not this year. President Rivlin began his message with an apology. You see, when Israel locked down in the spring, the president was caught having guests at his residence for the Passover Seder. He apologized for giving the impression that his loneliness was different, or the rules might be different for ordinary citizens versus people in power. This time, he promised, though, things would be different. Rak Yachad, only together. That's the only way to beat down this virus. United, we stand. You could call it the national mantra of the Jewish people. The way the Bible describes it, the beginning of the end was sparked by division. Hundreds of years before the Assyrians and Babylonians dealt their military blows. It was shortly after King Solomon's death. His son Rechavam was having trouble solidifying his role. The people felt they were being overworked in service of the king. They asked him to lighten the burden, but Rechavam refused. He wanted to prove his mettle. He wanted to demonstrate his strength, and so he decided to make their burden even greater. But the people revolted. Yeravam ben Nevat, who had been somewhat of an opposition leader, saw an opportunity. He rallied the people of the north, convinced them to break away, and created the kingdom of Israel, leaving Rechavam to rule the much smaller kingdom of Judah. The two kingdoms never reconciled. In 721 BCE, the Assyrians conquered the kingdom of Israel. The population was exiled, assimilated into their host countries. They became the lost tribes. And ever since, it has been our people's hope to someday be reunited. We read about it in the Haftarah on the second day of Rosh Hashanah, where Jeremiah promised, I will bring them in from the northland, gather them from the ends of the earth. In a vast throng they shall return here, and with compassion I will guide them. The one who scattered Israel will gather them and guard them as a shepherd guards his flock. Fast forward almost 2,500 years. Zionism was reborn as a political movement, and there were factions. Labor Zionists who dreamed of a socialist utopia, cultural Zionists who imagined a rebirth of Jewish cultural life, revisionist Zionists who wanted to fight in a new way for a new generation, religious Zionists who wanted to protect Judaism from secular influence. There were waves of Aliyah. Our people was decimated in the Holocaust. Remnants fought the British mandate, and then the opportunity for statehood suddenly emerged. But it's one thing to dream of a state, and quite another to make the dream a reality. The leadership of the Yishuv debated until the very last minute. Just hours before David Ben-Gurion was to declare the establishment of the state on May 14, 1948, Moetzet Ha'am, the Provisional Council, was meeting to iron out important details in the declaration. The borders had not been defined. There was a question of whether or not to mention God in the document. And then there was the name. Should it be Palestine? Aver, as in Ivrit, the land of the Hebrews? Zion, Judea, or Israel? Ultimately, the council chose Israel because the name Israel symbolized restoration. This was a chance to return. This was the fulfillment of our hope, a chance to restore a divide that had lasted almost 3,000 years, not just a state, but a reunified Jewish people. Rak Yachad, only together. But that's not exactly how it happened. I'll spare you the details. I'll spare you the jokes about 2 Jews, 3 opinions, a people built to argue, because we know it too well. J Street versus AIPAC versus ZOA versus Peace Now. Orthodox, conservative, Reform, secular, Ashkenazi, Sephardi. And we don't just disagree. We sometimes do it in the most uncivil of ways. People who hold different views are called Sonei Yisrael, haters, enemies of the Jewish people. We call them dangerous. Their ideas are delegitimized, and it hurts. Back to the pandemic. It happens that the ultra-Orthodox communities were among the hardest hit in Israel. It may be because many in these communities have large families and live in small apartments. It may be because they kept many of their schools open and continue to gather for large weddings and funerals. But they're also part of Prime Minister Netanyahu's fragile governing coalition. A lockdown implemented only in areas with high infection rates would disproportionately affect them and appear like discrimination. So the lockdown was instituted across the board, and with a host of exceptions that secular Israelis think discriminate against them. Orthodox women can go to the mikveh. Lulav and etrog are considered essential items, meaning people can travel further to purchase them. Many synagogues are allowed to open, but secular Israelis are not allowed to go to the mall or the hairdresser. The coronavirus, or corona, as it's referred to, has exacerbated festering resentments. And President Rivlin tried to address that. We must refrain from blaming other parts of the society as if one sector is responsible for the virus, he said. We have no other land. We have no other country. We have no other people. We have no other way. Rak Yachad, only together. The pandemic also exacerbates inequities between Israel's Jewish and Arab citizenry. Healthcare, education, and other infrastructure have long been deficient in Israeli Arab communities, and the pandemic makes it worse. And we know about Israel's regular challenges with the Palestinians and a divided political map that may send Israel back to elections yet again. The divisions are troubling. There are some opportunities. You may have seen the video of an Israeli ambulance stopping so that its 2 medics on board could pray. An Orthodox Jew davening mincha facing Jerusalem, and an Israeli Arab Muslim kneeling on his prayer mat facing Mecca. It turns out that 25% of Israeli doctors, 30% of nurses, 50% of Israeli pharmacists are Arab. So maybe the virus will offer a chance for that community to become more connected to their Jewish neighbors. Maybe that will positively impact some of the inequities. There's a lot of work to do, but ours is a country of hope. Rak Yachad, only together. And then, speaking of hope, there is the new peace. It came as a surprise to nearly everyone when Israel and the United Arab Emirates announced on August 13th their intent to normalize relations. And then on September 11th to hear that Bahrain would join too. Now, technically, the agreement signed at the White House on September 15th is not a peace treaty because the UAE and Bahrain were not at war with Israel. Actually, Bahrain and the UAE didn't exist in 1948 or 1967. But the treaties are extremely significant. The UAE did get Israel to agree to suspend indefinitely its plan to annex territories. Bahrain insisted on language to support a just and favorable outcome for the Palestinians. But on the whole, this agreement represented a giant strategic shift. You see, for decades it was assumed that the path to peace went through the Palestinians. Negotiate with the Palestinians, create a Palestinian state with a peaceful border, and the region's other states would follow and normalize relations. This was the opposite. Normalize relations first, and then use those relationships to hopefully create a broader Middle East peace. These two countries are attracted by Israel's strength, military strength to protect against Iran, economic strength bringing together the region's strongest success stories. Maybe the initiative will bring Palestinians back to the table, but right now, that dream seems a long way off. Still, though, the excitement is justified and real, as are the divisions. People want to know, will this strengthen Prime Minister Netanyahu? And what about President Trump? Will more evangelicals be drawn to the voting booth? Will more American Jews who have been critical of the Trump administration change their minds? Moving an embassy to Jerusalem, peace is a big deal. I'm not going to answer those questions because they're the wrong questions. Those questions that everybody wants to ask are rooted in the divisions of politics. The Jewish community, like any other demographic group, is not a monolith. There are legitimate questions about Israel's relationship with the Palestinians, a looming demographic threat, prospects for a two-state solution, finding a workable path forward. There are a host of real issues over which Americans and Israeli Jews, conservatives and progressives, Democrats and Republicans disagree. But political disagreements on those issues cannot mask the larger principles, value statements on which we all agree. The land of Israel is the birthplace and spiritual homeland of the Jewish people. The state of Israel is the legitimate realization of a national dream that had been suspended for 2,000 years. The state of Israel belongs to all Jews. We have a voice. We have a role. We share in Israel's destiny. All of us together. Biyachad. This is a time to rise above the politics, to re-engage and reaffirm our connections to our Jewish state. In a normal year, I would be asking you now to take out a pledge card and consider an investment in Israel bonds. It's a tangible way to affirm the relationship and invest in Israel's future. But this is not a normal year. The pledge cards have gone virtual. You can visit israelbonds.com. In a normal year, I would be suggesting that it's time to make plans to travel to Israel. There is no better way to understand, no better way to celebrate the miracle of a modern state in an ancient land than to be there. It's notable that Nativ, the conservative movement's gap year program in Israel, is running at full capacity. But for most of us, this is not the year to travel. And so we have to take advantage of other opportunities. We're so fortunate that Netta Asner Minter, our Shlicha extraordinaire, is back with us for another year. Anyone who has met her or been part of a class knows that she is special. Don't miss the opportunity to engage with her and to connect through her and to thank our Jewish Federation for supporting the program in a significant way. In a normal year, I'd be inviting you to think about attending the AIPAC Policy Conference, to be inspired by what is easily the largest Jewish event of the year, and to support the bipartisan U.S.-Israel relationship. But that conference has been canceled this year. Still, we can affirm the basic truth that regardless of party, Israel and America are better together. In a normal year, I would ask you to support the Masorti movement and its work for religious pluralism in Israel. And I would remind you that tonight is a night of Jewish unity, not because we all agree or practice in the same way, but because this sacred holiday transcends our differences. In Israel, everybody celebrates Yom Kippur. They don't all go to the synagogue, but everybody stops. Everybody knows. On Yom Kippur, everyone is together. Rak Yachad. In a few days, it will be Sukkot. We will gather the 4 species, the lulav, the etrog, the myrtles, the willow. The rabbis of the Talmud talk about the importance of that bundle. A person does not fulfill the obligation, they say, until the species are bound together ba'aguda achat, in a single bundle. V'chein Yisrael b'hartza'ah. And so it is with the Jewish people when they fast and pray for acceptance by God. Their prayers are not answered ad sheyihiyu kulan ba'aguda achat, until we are all bound together in a single bundle. In a pandemic, before an election, when celebrating the tremendous accomplishments of our tiny little country, or navigating the realities of war and peace and economic recession, people debate. Reasonable minds will draw different conclusions, but we can rise above the rancor. We must reach out, connect, engage with our people and our land. Because on Yom Kippur night and every night, there is only one imaginable future for the Jewish state and the Jewish people. Rak Yachad. Only together. Gemar Chatima Tova. May we all be inscribed and sealed for good in the book of life. Amen. And now we're going to continue our service. We're going to turn to page 224. Continuing with the Slichot service, our pleas for mercy. All flesh comes to you, you who hear prayer. All flesh.